Good evening. As you can see, the title of this presentation is the Evolving JFK Autopsy Report, Managing the Presentation of So-Called Facts to Support the Myth of a Lone Assassin in Dallas. Now, when I recorded my original presentation, the JFK Medical Cover-Up, Events at Bethesda Naval Hospital, I did not have time to include this information in that presentation. But since that time, I've reconsidered, and I approached Jacob Hornberger and asked him if we could find time to present this material, and he agreed that it was so important that we should do that. So here we are. And it almost goes without saying as we proceed here that if your only client was the truth, there would not be an evolving JFK autopsy report. If your only client was the truth, there would be no need to keep changing the report. And as you will soon learn, there were 4 sets of conclusions coming out of the autopsy, and the final 3 sets of conclusions were in writing. There were 3 written versions of those conclusions. This is a very sorry state of affairs. Let's continue. I begin with a quote here from George Orwell. Quote, "In a time of universal deceit, telling the truth is a revolutionary act," end quote. We live in a world today where we have politics dictated by the media, war filtered and defined and presented by the media, retribution by the media, and sometimes intentional diversion engineered by the media. The mainstream media has become the public relations agent for the executive branch and its intelligence establishment in matters related to national security, in matters related to war and assassination. Regretfully, many people are too busy or too lazy to engage in independent and critical thinking, which involves challenging truths that they are presented with by authority. Independent and critical thinking is certainly not taught up through the 12th grade in American schools. Challenging the pronouncements of authority is essential to a healthy democracy. I firmly believe in that, and I believe it's a basic tenet of all independent JFK citizen researchers. Blind deference to the pronouncements of authority is all too prevalent today. The only thing I'll say in defense of today is that it's much less prevalent than it was 50 or 60 years ago. 50 or 60 years ago, almost everyone believed whatever the government said to be true. At the time President Kennedy was assassinated, a belief in the integrity of the government statements and that the government would do the right thing most or all the time and would tell the truth was at an all-time high. But beginning about 3 or 4 weeks after his assassination, it began to plummet, and it's been eroding rapidly ever since. Now, in the next 5 slides, you will see that there were several versions of the JFK autopsy report. Let's begin with the first written draft. The first written draft was reviewed Saturday, November 23rd, 1963, by Dr. Humes and Dr. Boswell at Bethesda. It was then reviewed by Captain Canada, who I remind you was the commanding officer of the treatment hospital at Bethesda. And after struggling with it for 4 or 5 or 6 hours Saturday afternoon, Dr. Humes began rewriting it about 11 p.m. Saturday evening at his home and finished the revision at 3 or 4 a.m. Sunday morning. He then destroyed the first draft along with original notes from the autopsy by burning them in his fireplace. Now, this is my construction of what really went down. This is what happened. And yet, originally, Dr. Humes presented one version of this to Arlen Specter of the Warren Commission staff. He presented a different version to the House Select Committee, and we got a third version from Dr. Boswell at his review board deposition. So let's reveal how we came to understand this sequence of events. Dr. Humes testified to the HSCA that he began writing the report only at 11 p.m. Saturday. But Dr. Boswell testified to the ARRB that he and Humes began reviewing a typewritten draft at 10 o'clock a.m. Saturday morning at Bethesda Naval Hospital, and that they then reviewed the microscopic work, the tissue slides made the night before at the autopsy, about noon, and that they then made revisions to the draft report after that. Dr. Fink was not present at the Bethesda review of the first draft. This is a very interesting fact. At the end of John Stringer's deposition, you'll recall he was the official autopsy photographer. At the end of his deposition, I was standing with him in the lobby of Archives 2 in College Park, Maryland. He was waiting for his ride to show up. And I said to Stringer, "Why do you think Dr. Fink wasn't present at the brain exam that you witnessed and photographed?" And an enigmatic smile came over his face. And he said, quote, "I don't think they wanted Dr. Fink there. He caused too much trouble at the autopsy," end quote. And just as I was about to ask him some follow-on questions, his ride appeared and he drove off, and that was the end of that conversation. But it's important that Fink was not invited to review this typewritten first draft. Now, the Navy letter of transmittal for the autopsy report is dated November 24th, and it states that Captain Canada reviewed it in part and that Humes destroyed, quote, "early draft notes," end quote, by burning. The homemade certificate acknowledging the destruction of the notes prepared by Humes stated that he burned, quote, "preliminary draft notes," end quote. Now, there's another problem with notes. Dr. Leonard Saslaw, a PhD in chemistry, a food chemist at the Armed Forces Institute of Pathology, a former colleague of Dr. Fink, the third autopsy pathologist, he executed an affidavit for the review board in which he stated that Dr. Fink complained loudly the week after the autopsy that his notes taken at the autopsy had disappeared that night before he left Bethesda to go home. And he was so upset about this, he was sharing it with his lunchtime companions in the lunchroom and speaking quite loudly about it so that it was overheard by Dr. Saslaw. Now, David Lifton discovered this witness, and he provided the review board with this lead. We interviewed him independently. We decided he was credible. We prepared an affidavit. He reviewed it. He made a few changes. He signed the affidavit. Now, we're still talking about the first written draft. Dr. Humes admitted to Arlen Specter in his Warren Commission testimony that he burned the first draft of the autopsy protocol in his fireplace after revising it. That's a very important statement. After revising it, he burned the first draft. In his HSCA testimony, Humes made a valiant effort to discuss only the destruction of autopsy notes that had blood on them to prevent them from becoming an item of morbid curiosity for collectors. The HSCA counsel questioning him, Mr. Cornwell, showed no curiosity whatsoever or even awareness about the destruction of the first draft. The review board general counsel, Jeremy Gunn, questioned Humes at length about the two alternative descriptions of what he had burned in his fireplace. During this rigorous questioning, Humes admitted twice under oath that he destroyed both the first draft of the autopsy report and the blood-stained working notes from the autopsy to prevent the notes from becoming objects of morbid curiosity. Now, when he admitted to burning both, Jeremy Gunn said to Dr. Humes, "Well, the first draft didn't have blood on it, did it? You didn't write the first draft during the autopsy." Humes had to admit, "No, I didn't write the first draft during the autopsy, and it did not have blood on it." But he admitted burning both under oath before the review board in 1996. Following this exchange, Gunn asked Dr. Humes why he did not destroy the autopsy descriptive sheet. Now, the autopsy descriptive sheet, for those of you who may not be familiar with it, is a set of notes. It's a pre-printed form, and on one side are the places to write the weights of the various organs removed from the human body during the autopsy, and it has two sides of a body chart, a front and back of a body chart, where you can draw the wounds. And on the back of this autopsy descriptive sheet, produced at the autopsy on JFK, Dr. Boswell had made his famous freehand sketch of the damage to the top of the skull, showing that almost all the bone was missing from the top of the skull. So Jeremy asked Dr. Humes, why didn't you destroy this page of notes? And he didn't get a good answer. He got a flippant answer from Dr. Humes. Humes could not provide any explanation for this at all. I believe the sketch was essential to selling the enormous damage to the top of JFK's head, the huge skull defect, to selling that as damage caused by an assassin's bullet. That sketch was essential to selling to the audience after 8 o'clock what they were looking at, to selling it to posterity. So, I should just point out that Dr. Humes' demeanor during his review board questioning was at times defensive and at times arrogant. When frustrated and unable to provide answers to tough questions, he alternated between bluster and nonsensical, flippant responses. And in this case, we got a flippant response. Oh, I don't know why I didn't destroy it. Maybe I just felt like keeping it. So that's a response, but it's not an answer. So the first smooth version of the autopsy report, the first version that was signed by all three pathologists on Sunday, November 24th at Bethesda. But it cannot be the signed autopsy report in evidence today. I repeat, it cannot be the signed autopsy report in the National Archives today. All three pathologists told the review board under oath that there was only one signed version of the autopsy report. But careful examination of the autopsy report receipt trail reveals that this cannot be true. And we'll be looking at that receipt trail in the next few slides. The receipt trail indicates that the Secret Service relinquished two different JFK autopsy reports on two occasions to two different parties. The first signed version, relinquished by the Secret Service, was transferred to the custody of Evelyn Lincoln at the request of Robert Kennedy on April 26, 1965, per paragraph 9 of the transfer inventory, which reads in part, quote, complete autopsy protocol of President Kennedy, original in 7 copies, original signed by Dr. Humes, pathologist, end quote. When the Kennedy family was forced by federal statute to relinquish all autopsy materials to the National Archives, they failed to return the items in paragraph 9 on the original inventory listing. The paragraph 9 items included the brain, many tissue slides, many blood slides, memos about autopsy photography, and the original signed autopsy report in 7 copies. Now, the Kennedy family deed of gift document, dated October 29, 1966, reproduced only 7 of the 9 paragraphs of the April 1965 inventory. Omitted from the deed of gift was the broken casket handle, which was paragraph 1 in the original inventory, and all of the paragraph 9 materials. Now, I would remind you that 2 days after this important deed of gift letter was signed, the materials being returned to the government were returned in a footlocker by the Kennedy family representatives, who immediately left the room. The National Archives persons present immediately compared the 2 inventories, the original inventory from 65 and the deed of gift letter from 66. And they noted that paragraph 1 and paragraph 9 were missing from the deed of gift letter. And that while the broken casket handle was present, that all of the paragraph 9 materials were missing. They put this in a memo on October 31st. 1966. Now, the autopsy report and evidence today, Commission Exhibit 387, was transmitted by the Secret Service to the National Archives by a letter of transmittal, get this, on October 2nd, 1967, and signed for by the National Archives on October 3rd, 1967. I made this discovery while working on the review board staff, doing my chain of custody study on the autopsy report. The significance is as follows. The Secret Service, therefore, transmitted an original autopsy report twice, a physical impossibility if there was only one signed autopsy report. Let's review what happened. The first signed original was relinquished by the Secret Service on April 26th, 1965. And this was duly noted in the inventory prepared by Dr. Berkeley and signed by Dr. Berkeley and 3 members of the Secret Service. A second signed original was relinquished by the Secret Service on October 2nd, 1967, to the National Archives, where it resides today. I conclude that the Kennedy family never returned the original autopsy report they received in April of 1965 to the U.S. government. If they had, it would have been carefully documented by the Kennedy family attorney, Burke Marshall. Now, I'm going to provide you with my own intelligent speculation on where the missing autopsy report is today, the missing signed version, signed on Sunday, November 24th. I believe the probable location of the missing first signed version is at the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean, inside the Dallas casket, the heavy bronze casket that weighed over 400 pounds empty, which was dumped at sea from an airplane on February 18th, 1966, at the direct order of Robert F. Kennedy. Now, some of you may not have known about this, but this is a true story. The documents that document what happened were in response to review board inquiries about the casket, but they weren't released until 1999, the year after we shut down. We shut down on September 30th, 1998. And then during the following year, these documents were suddenly placed in the National Archives. I think the delay was intentional to try to avoid attracting attention to what had happened. Of course, it didn't work. There were articles in the newspaper on the National Wire about this story in 1999. My personal conclusion is that the key paragraph 9 materials on the April 1965 inventory, what remained of Kennedy's brain, tissue and blood slides, autopsy photography memos, and the first signed autopsy report were placed inside the bronze Dallas casket before it was dumped at sea by a C-130 aircraft. Here's why I believe this. A highly trained naval officer, Commander Carlisle Trost, was sent down to a warehouse at Andrews Air Force Base shortly before this airplane took off. I think it was the day before. And to examine the Dallas casket that was going to be dumped at sea to make sure that it would sink. Now, who did they send down there to do this examination? They sent down a man who had already commanded, he'd already been the commanding officer of a nuclear-powered submarine. He already had staff duty in the Pentagon at the time. He was obviously a hot runner, someone destined for bigger and better things, someone that was trusted. You don't need a man who has already commanded a nuclear-powered submarine to tell you whether there are enough holes drilled in a metal casket to make it sink. That's ridiculous. But someone might have trusted him very much to take a sealed package containing the paragraph 9 materials down to Andrews and place it inside the bronze casket before it was sealed and strapped onto a wooden pallet. I mean, there were 80 holes drilled in this casket. There were sandbags put in it, very heavy sandbags. There was no doubt it was going to sink. You didn't need Commander Trost to tell you that. We know that the Kennedy family did not return the paragraph 9 materials to the government later that year. We know, as you see in the last paragraph here, that Burke Marshall, the Kennedy family attorney, told the HSCA staff, and this is printed in volume 7 of their report on page 28, that it was his opinion that RFK, quote, obtained and disposed of these materials himself, end quote, and that he was, quote, certain that obtaining or locating these materials is no longer possible, end quote. Now, there's an alternative explanation for where the materials might be, and that explanation was published by Gus Russo in his book. Researcher Gus Russo speculated that the paragraph 9 materials might have been buried in the new gravesite when President Kennedy's casket was reinterred in, I believe it was 1967, circa 1967, moved from its burial site in 1963, just a few feet away, something like 25 or 33 feet away, very close by, into a different burial site, where it remains today underneath some very handsome flagstones. Now, we have photographs from the reinterment. It happened late at night. There were only a few people there. One of them was Robert Kennedy, the president's brother. There is a wooden box in the photograph sitting on the ground, but the superintendent of Arlington Cemetery, Mr. Metzler, told the House Select Committee that nothing else was put in the new gravesite. Nothing but the huge vault that encased the president's casket was put in the new gravesite. So I defer to his statement. You know, the president's casket, the mahogany casket he was buried in, was placed inside a huge 3,000-pound vault, which was sealed with tar. When the top lid was put on the vault after burial, it was sealed with hot tar. You can see in the images of the reinterments at night in 1967 that there's a crane lifting this heavy vault through the air into the new gravesite. The vault was never opened. It would have required a lot of work to open it. It was not opened. There were many witnesses to the fact that it was not opened. And the superintendent of the cemetery says nothing else was placed in the gravesite. So my speculation is that it's at the bottom of the ocean. If we have to speculate on why Robert Kennedy would have done that, the only benign explanation I can come up with is that he did not want his brother's remains, what remained of his brain and the blood and tissue slides, to become objects of morbid curiosity. You know, the same explanation Humes gave for burning autopsy notes. In Robert Kennedy's case, it may have been the real reason. Now, if he did that, if he dumped these materials at sea inside the Dallas casket, it's a shame, because today, if we had the remains of the brain, we could do DNA testing and determine whether it was tissue from the Kennedy family and authenticate it, essentially, and study what was left of the brain for evidence. But at least we could authenticate it with DNA testing. But we're not going to have access to it. The Dallas casket is in thousands of feet of water in an ammunition dumping area. So it's in an area that's unsafe and very, very deep. It's completely inaccessible, as Burke Marshall said it was. If the Kennedys had retained this for a future investigation, I think we would have heard about it by now. We would have heard about it, and the materials would have been studied, but we haven't heard anything about it, so I think it's at the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean. And unfortunately, what went with the brain was the first signed version of the autopsy report. Now, the inevitable conclusion here is that the JFK autopsy report in the National Archives today is only the third written version. It is not a true original. Furthermore, it is an undated document. So we don't know what date it was actually completed and signed. The first draft, reviewed by Humes and Boswell, on Saturday, November 23rd at Bethesda, and rewritten by Humes late Saturday night and early Sunday morning, was burned. The first signed version, signed on Sunday the 24th, must therefore be the signed original given to the Kennedy family in April 1965 and listed in paragraph 9 of the April inventory in 1965. It was never returned to the U.S. government, and Burke Marshall, as I've just explained, told the HSCA that RFK had disposed of it, of all the paragraph 9 materials, and that obtaining and locating them was no longer possible. Now, it can clearly be demonstrated that in addition to these timeline problems, the content of the autopsy report changed in each written version, and we'll be discussing this in the next slides, proving that official truth in the JFK assassination was malleable. Therefore, the existing autopsy report, Commission Exhibit 387, would be successfully challenged at trial today, if there was a trial, and it would not be admitted into evidence. It is not the first written version, and it's not even the first signed version. And the autopsy conclusions were revised 3 times, which we'll discuss on the next slide. If the existing autopsy report was not admitted into evidence at a trial today, there would be no official conclusion that JFK was hit only from behind and only by 2 shots. That conclusion comes solely from Commission Exhibit 387, this final version of the autopsy report. Now, this may be the most important slide in the presentation. I want you to understand that there were actually 4 sets of conclusions about what happened to President Kennedy during the shooting. The first set was an oral set of conclusions announced by Dr. Humes at the autopsy before 11 o'clock. That's when the FBI agents departed. The next 3 sets of conclusions were put in writing in various versions of the autopsy report. So let's go through these 4 sets of conclusions. So before 11 o'clock p.m., Dr. Humes made a grand announcement to the morgue audience. The pattern was clear, he said. The president was hit by 2 shots from behind, 1 in the head, 1 entry wound low in the back of the head, and 1 in the back. And as described at the time, the back wound was shallow and did not exit the body, did not transit the body. In fact, Humes' public charade before the morgue audience from 8 to 11 had him announcing that he couldn't find a bullet in the body, represented by the shallow back wound. He couldn't find a bullet. And then when he was informed later that a bullet had been found on a stretcher in Dallas, he assumed that it was that bullet, and so that ostensibly satisfied him at the time. Now, we know that the body was turned over to Gawler's funeral home morticians at 11:45. We know that from some of their documents, which survived and which were authenticated by Mr. Hagan to the review board. So sometime between 11 and 11:45, this set of conclusions changed. And the reason we know that is there's a person named Lieutenant Lipsey, who was once the aide to General Wheel. Now, General Wheel was the commandant of the military district of Washington. He was responsible for the 4 days of ceremonies surrounding President Kennedy's burial and funeral. And his aide was Lieutenant Lipsey. So Lieutenant Lipsey was interviewed by the HSCA staff in 1978. And he told them he was absolutely certain that he heard the chief pathologist announce that there were 3 hits from behind, not 2. And that anyone who said there were only 2 hits didn't know what they were talking about. He was really sure of himself. He was so sure of himself, he drew a diagram for the HSCA, which I've published in volume 1 of my book. And his diagram shows 3 hits, bullet 1, bullet 2, and bullet 3. Now, his bullet 1 is the bullet in the head. It enters in the head and exits from elsewhere on the head. His bullet 3 is the shallow back wound, which enters high in the back and doesn't exit the body. His bullet number 2 is new information that Humes did not announce prior to 11 o'clock. His bullet number 2 enters low in the back of the head, and he draws a dot where it entered, very low in JFK's head, near the hairline, and exited the tracheotomy site, if you can believe that. Now, one reason to believe Lieutenant Lipsey and to believe that he's telling the truth about what he heard between 11 and 11:45 and to not believe he's mistaken is that Tom Robinson, the Gawler's funeral home mortician interviewed by the review board in 1996, told us that he recalled Dr. Humes inserting a long metal probe very low in the back of the president's head, and that eventually the probe exited the front of the throat, where the tracheotomy site was. I'm going to repeat that. Tom Robinson recalled to the review board, to a room full of review board witnesses, that Dr. Humes inserted a probe low in the back of the head, which eventually exited from the tracheotomy site in the front of the neck. Never mind how ridiculous that is. For a bullet to do something like that, it would have to miraculously somehow transit the foramen magnum. That's the hole at the bottom of your skull that your spinal cord and your cervical vertebrae go through. The vertebrae that support your skull go through the foramen magnum. A bullet would have had to have gone through there and then somehow come out the front of your neck without striking cervical vertebrae. But that's what he witnessed with a probe. Oddly enough, Dr. Humes mentioned to his next door neighbor, and this is in the set of CBS memos, which I discussed in the first presentation, he mentioned an x-ray of a probe going through the neck, coming out the tracheotomy site. Of course, that x-ray is not in the collection today, but he mentioned such an x-ray. So Humes seems to corroborate Robinson, and Robinson certainly corroborates Lipsey's bullet number 2. So I invite you to look at that diagram he made. It's in volume 1 of my book. Now, the conclusions changed again on Sunday. My conclusion, by the way, is that the Lipsey scenario, the 3 shots hitting JFK from behind, which I just discussed, that was the contents of the first draft of the autopsy report, the typewritten draft reviewed by Humes and Boswell Saturday morning at 10 a.m. It makes sense. If that's what Lieutenant Lipsey heard Humes say very late, after 11 o'clock p.m. at the autopsy and before 11:30 p.m., then it's likely what Humes put in the first typewritten draft, which he arrived at Bethesda with in his hand, already typed at 10 a.m. Saturday morning. By the way, here's what I think happened. Dr. Humes called Dr. Perry in Dallas after the FBI agents left the morgue. And Dr. Perry proceeded to tell him about a bullet wound in the throat and that it was a shot from the front. It was an entry wound. Well, this created a serious problem for Dr. Humes. His instructions clearly, we know today his instructions had to have been to not discuss any shots from the front, to only report shots from the rear, and to try to obliterate or remove evidence of shots from the front, and certainly not to report them. So he had a problem now. He had Dr. Perry reporting to him on the phone an entrance wound from the front, in the front of the neck, in the throat. So somehow he had to turn that into an exit wound. So I want to point out to you that Dr. Ebersol, the radiologist at the autopsy, said in his HSCA testimony in 1978 that he thought there was a phone call with Dallas, from the morgue to Dallas, about 10:30 p.m. And later in his deposition, he said, it might have been later than that. It might have been later that night. Well, I'm telling you, it was later than that. It was after 11, because the FBI agents left at 11. Dr. Humes said that twice under oath. So if they had heard a 3-hit scenario, they would have put that in their report, which they wrote the day after the funeral, November 26th. But no, that's not what they put in their report. They put the 2-hit scenario in their report that Humes announced before 11 o'clock. So this phone call did take place Dr. Ebersol was just about half an hour off, or maybe 35 or 40 minutes off in time. It did happen late that night. And by the way, the dot that Lieutenant Lipsey put in his diagram for the entry site for his bullet number 2 is exactly where we see a white spot on the photographs of the back of the president's head. The photographs from the autopsy that show the back of the president's head supposedly intact show a red spot up high near the corner of a ruler, which the Clark panel and the HSCA wanted to be the entrance wound. It also shows a so-called white spot, which looks white in the black and white photos published by the HSCA, low in the head, very low in the head, near the hairline, just above the neck. That's where Lipsey put his dot for the entrance of bullet number 2. And I'm telling you that when I examined the digitized scans of the autopsy photos at Kodak in Rochester, New York, we had the autopsy images digitized by Kodak for preservation purposes. When we examined the blow-ups of the digital scans on high-resolution monitors, this white spot didn't look like a white spot anymore. It looked like a puncture in the skull with brain matter, bloody brain matter, oozing out of it. It was tissue extruding from a wound, very clearly. And by the way, Dr. Fink agrees with my assessment. I was recently reviewing his testimony before the HSCA. And when he was questioned about that photo, he said that he thought it depicted tissue extruding from a wound in the skull. So he and I had the same impressions looking into this photo, and this was exactly where Lipsey said bullet number 2 entered. It's exactly where Tom Robinson said a probe entered the back of the skull and then later came out the front of the neck. The implications are very disturbing. So, a new scenario, back to only 2 hits from behind, arrives on November 24th. That's the day the first autopsy report is signed. The first signed version is created on the 24th. We know that we're back to a 2-hit scenario because of the official press leaks about what was in this autopsy report. Now, I'll get into the press leaks in just a moment, but the press leaks quote the autopsy pathologists, and they say that the autopsy report says that the wound in the throat was caused by a fragment from the headshot, not from a bullet, not from a whole bullet. I say again, this report signed on Sunday said that the throat wound seen in Dallas was caused by a fragment from the headshot. Well, this was very inventive by Dr. Humes and his colleagues. I don't know if he thought of it himself or if he was directed to say that, but it's very inventive by somebody. Now, I don't think this version lasted more than 2 days before it had to be abandoned, because if you examine the Zapruder film, it clearly shows President Kennedy reacting to a strong stimulus to his neck, some stimulus to his neck, by raising his 2 forearms with clenched fists, raising them in front of his face, in front of his neck. A defensive response, apparently. And the head explosion does not occur until much later in the Zapruder film. So his reaction to a throat stimulus, to some stimulus to his neck, occurs long before the head explosion does in the Z film. So that film began to proliferate on Tuesday, the 26th. More and more people began to view it, copies of it. And I'm sure very quickly after this report was signed on Sunday, somebody said, oh no, we've got to change the autopsy report again. We can't have this in the record. It's contradicted by the Zapruder film. This version signed on Sunday, which went back to a 2-hit scenario, had something else in it that was odd. According to what Dr. Fink told the Clay Shaw defense team in Clay Shaw's trial in New Orleans in 1969, Dr. Fink told his defense team that the brain had been severed from the spinal cord by the assassin's bullet, as described in the autopsy report. That's a direct quote from the defense counsel documents. Quote of what Fink said, that was described in the autopsy report. Well, if you look at the autopsy report today, you don't have to go to the archives. You can pull out your Warren Commission and read it. There's no mention of the brain being severed from the spinal cord by the assassin's bullet. But yet Fink was saying in 1969 that was in the autopsy report. In other words, it's in the report he signed. It was in the report he signed. So, ending up here, Commission Exhibit 387, that's in the archives today. It's the only signed autopsy report in the archives today, which was shown to the Dallas doctors on December 11th by Secret Service agent Elmer Moore. It says there were 2 hits from behind. One was the headshot. But now, the entry wound in the back is no longer a shallow wound that didn't go anywhere. It's now been changed in the report to a bullet that transited the neck and came out the front of the throat at the tracheotomy site. So for the very first time, Dr. Humes and his colleagues have stated in writing that a bullet entered high in the back, transited his neck, and came out the front of his throat. But they didn't say that in writing until the 3rd written version of the autopsy report. Really critical to understand that. Now, this is a micro-study of the press leaks. These are official leaks from the government to the press for the purpose of getting them in the media, getting them in the public mind. And they they're published on December the 18th, as you see here, in 2 newspapers, and on December 27th in Time magazine. And just in case you didn't read the Post or the Inquirer, everybody read Time magazine. So both published articles quoting the findings of the pathologist in the autopsy report talk about 2 bullets. In the newspaper articles written by Nate Hazeltine, it says that the first bullet hit Kennedy 5 to 7 inches below the collar line, and that the bullet was found. This is so important, I put it in red. The bullet was found deep in his shoulder. This is really interesting. First of all, the 5 to 7 inches below the collar line is consistent with the holes in JFK's clothing, which are between 5 and 7 inches below the collar of his coat and the collar of his shirt. The autopsy report today in the archives doesn't talk about any bullet found deep in his shoulder, but these leaks did, these official leaks did. And this confirms what Paul O'Connor told the House Select Committee on Assassinations in 1977, before he talked to any JFK researchers. He told them that he was kicked out of the morgue for about 40 minutes, placed under guard by the Marines in the hallway, and when he went back in the morgue, he was told by one of his colleagues who had stayed in the room that a bullet was found between Kennedy's ribs in his back and was removed from intercostal tissue. Well, this confirms that Paul O'Connor wasn't making this up. Now, the second bullet, according to the Nate Hazeltine article, tore off the right rear portion of Kennedy's head so destructively as to be incompatible with life, and that a fragment was deflected from this headshot and passed out the front of the throat. Notice, first of all, that these leaks are talking about damage to the right rear portion of the head. That's really interesting. That's what everybody at Parkland Hospital saw, the right rear portion of the head damage. That's what almost every Bethesda witness saw. That's not what's in the autopsy photographs, but they're still talking about the real exit wound in the head in this leak. But then they say a fragment from this headshot was deflected and passed out the front of the throat. It's clear from its context they're talking about the headshot bullet, a fragment passed out the front of the throat. Now, in the Time magazine article, there's no ambiguity anymore. First of all, they still talk about a back wound 6 inches below the collar line. They say it had penetrated 2 or 3 inches. They don't say anymore whether it had been removed or not. It's almost as if somebody said, oops, we better not say removed. We better say it penetrated 2 or 3 inches. But it's crystal clear in the Time magazine article that the throat wound seen by the Parkland physicians was made by a fragment from the exploding headshot bullet. I read, quote, "The throat wound had been made by a fragment of the last bullet, which literally exploded in Kennedy's head," end quote. There's no ambiguity here. So it's not made by a whole bullet. It's made by a fragment, and the fragment comes from the headshot. So these are the contents of this version signed on the 24th, along with the fact that it also said the brain was severed from the spinal cord by the bullet. We know that was in that report too. Now, I just mentioned this. Dr. Fink made this statement to the Clayshaw defense team. The problem is, it's not stated in the autopsy report we have today in the National Archives. It doesn't say the brain was severed from the spinal cord. Now, there's a transcript that exists, a verbatim transcript made by a court reporter of an executive session transcript of the Warren Commissioners with their lead attorney, J. Lee Rankin, on January 27th, 1964. It was formerly classified top secret. If they'd been smart, they would have kept it classified because it reveals utter and total confusion by the people talking about the wounds. The first three quotes here are by Rankin. "Then there is a great range of material in regard to the wounds," he said, "and the autopsy and this point of exit or entrance of the bullet in the front of the neck. And that all has to be developed much more than we have at the present time," end quote. So you can see, he's not sure in his own mind, their lead staff attorney, whether this wound in the throat is an exit or an entrance. It sounds like he's been paying attention to the early press reports. Maybe he heard Dr. Perry say that at the death press conference. Maybe he read the early newspaper reports and read about an entrance wound in the throat. But he's clearly aware that later these reports say it's an exit. So he's very confused about that. Then he says we have an explanation there in the autopsy that probably a fragment came out the front of the neck. There's two important things about this sentence. He says fragment came out the front of the neck. We know what he's talking about from the press leaks on the previous slide. He's talking about a fragment from the headshot that came out the front of the neck. The official press leaks, press reports reveal that that's what he means here. That's the context of his use of the word fragment. You note he says in the autopsy, an explanation in the autopsy. He doesn't say an explanation in the Washington Post, in the Philadelphia Inquirer, or in Time magazine. So it's as if he has the actual first signed version of the report in front of him. And I think he may have had, because he says the explanation here in the autopsy that a fragment came out the front of the neck. He means in an autopsy report. So he continues in his confusion, quote, "It seems quite apparent now, since we have the picture of where the bullet entered in the back, that the bullet entered below the shoulder blade to the right of the backbone, which is below the place where the picture shows the bullet came out in the neckband of the shirt in front. And the bullet, according to the autopsy, didn't strike any bone at all, and that bullet and went through," end quote. Confusing syntax, but you can see what he's saying. He's referencing a photograph of the back wound and saying that that bullet that caused the back wound went through the neck and came out the front of the neck. Now, he says something incorrect, that it went through the neckband of the shirt. That's not true. We know from Dr. Carrico, who was interviewed in the mid-60s by Harold Weisberg, and whose interview was published in Post-Mortem by Harold Weisberg, that the entry wound in the throat was above the collar. The bullet did not go through the collar. It did not penetrate the neckband of the shirt, as Rankin thought. There are two slits in the shirt where you button the top button on the shirt, where you button the shirt collar. And there's a nick in the tie, but those two slits in the collar band and the nick on the tie are caused by scalpels. It's very clear from the interview of nurses, and I believe from Carrico's interview, that these are scalpel cuts from the hurried removal of the president's clothing during his emergency treatment. Nurses are in a hurry, and they always remove clothing with scissors and scalpels just to get it off of the person so his wounds can be examined. Now, Commissioner Hale Boggs, in response to Rankin, says, quote, "I thought I read that bullet just went in a finger's length." Now, it's clear he's talking about the entry wound in the upper back. And when he says, "I thought it just went in a finger's length," he's talking about what's in the FBI summary report, which came out in December. And then a supplemental report was also put out by the FBI in January. So he's referring to a shallow back wound, which is the charade that Seibert and O'Neill witnessed Humes talking about. "I can feel the end of the wound with my little finger. You know, there's no bullet in here. I don't know where the bullet is. There's no bullet in the body," all that stuff. So that was memorialized in their report written November 26th, and that remained in all the FBI reports. That's what Hale Boggs is referring to. And Rankin responds to him by saying, "Well, that's what they first said." It's a pretty sad state of affairs. There's conflicting evidence in different reports, and these men are hopelessly confused. What this all reveals is that there was an incompetent cover-up about the throat wound, revealed by a timeline of statements. Let's go through them as quickly as we can. It's worth going through these in detail because it reveals how sloppy and how incompetent this cover-up was. White House transcript 1327C recorded the comments of Dr. Perry and Dr. Clark at the death press conference, the afternoon President Kennedy died. This is the press conference where the Secret Service reportedly confiscated the videotape shortly thereafter. And later, when the Warren Commission asked the Secret Service if there was a transcript of it, Secret Service lied and said no. But if you look at White House transcript 1327C, you'll see that it has a Secret Service date timestamp on it that reads as follows, quote, "Received by the U.S. Secret Service, 1963, November 26, a.m., 11:40, Office of the Chief," end quote. That's a pretty damning timestamp. The Secret Service did have a transcript. It was made by White House recorder Wayne Hawks. It was his job to record press conferences, and he did in that afternoon with his machine. He was a court reporter, and he made it verbatim transcript. And in that transcript, Dr. Perry stated 3 times, JFK had a bullet entrance wound in his neck, a bullet fired from the front, without any ambiguity. Okay, so the first draft of the autopsy report, per Richard Lipsey's 3-shot scenario that he gave the House Select Committee, the first draft of the autopsy report said that bullet number 2 entered low in the back of the skull, where the white spot is in the photos, and exited the throat. So this first draft, reviewed by Humes and Boswell Saturday morning, which surely had in it the Lipsey scenario, said that the throat wound was now caused by a bullet exiting, not entering. So Dr. Perry said it was a bullet entering from the front. This first draft of the autopsy report said it was an exiting bullet. It was reversed. Now, the first signed version of the report, signed on Sunday, November 24th, which we've been talking about, said the throat wound was caused by an exiting fragment from the headshot. We just talked about all that. So we've gone now, in these first 3 bullet points, from an entrance wound in the front of the neck to an exit wound for a whole bullet in the front of the neck to a little hole caused by an exiting fragment from the headshot. This story keeps changing. Now, there was an outrageous lie, an outright lie, published by Life magazine in its December 6th, 1963 issue. There's no way it can be a mistake. It's a blatant lie because they owned the film and they would have known what the contents of the film were. And this lie says, but the other bullet, the doctor reported, entered the president's throat from the front and then lodged in his body. Hence the recurring guess that there was a second sniper somewhere else. But the 8mm film, they're talking about the Zapruder film, the film they own, shows the president turning his body far around to the right as he waves to someone in the crowd. His throat is exposed toward the sniper's nest just before he clutches it, end quote. Anybody who's seen the Zapruder film, even one time, knows this is a lie. And they got away with this because Life magazine never licensed the film to be shown as a motion picture from 1963 to 1975. I repeat, from 63 to 75, the public never saw the Zapruder film as a motion picture. The Time Life didn't allow it. The film was only shown to the Warren Commission and the Warren Commission staff. Only in 1975, when the public saw the film for the first time, did we become aware that this was a blatant falsehood. And that was the year when Robert Groden showed his bootleg copy of the film on ABC TV. After which Time Life sold it back to the family, the Zapruder family, for $1. They didn't have any more interest in the cover-up at that point. They'd already been burned, so they sold it and got rid of it for $1. Okay. The FBI summary report of December 9th and their supplemental report of January 13th reported the findings of Agent Seibert and O'Neill, of those two agents, which were put in their 302 report of November 26th. So their observations were memorialized in their report of the 26th of November, and they kept reappearing in official FBI reports. And that was that no bullet wound of the neck was acknowledged at all. And I'm talking about no transiting bullet. That's what I mean here. No transiting bullet wound of the neck was acknowledged at all by either the FBI or the Secret Service. To this day, remains the state of affairs. To this day, the FBI position and the Secret Service position remains unchanged. And their position then and now is that 2 bullets hit President Kennedy from behind. One hit him in the skull. One hit him in the back and created a shallow wound and did not transit the body. That is the official position today of both of those federal agencies. Now, the second signed autopsy report, the version in the archives today, was shown to the Dallas doctors at Parkland Hospital on December 11th, 1963, by Secret Service agent Elmer Moore. He wrote a report about this. This was a not so subtle way of telling the Dallas doctors, you guys were wrong. You guys talked about an entrance wound in the throat, but this report says it's an exit wound. This report says it's an exit wound for a bullet that entered high in the back and then came out the front of the neck. So it was a way of telling them, you're wrong. Now, based on the executive session transcript that I quoted from just a moment ago, Mr. Rankin had 2 alternate versions of the autopsy report before him and a contradicting FBI report. Remember, he's talking about a fragment from the headshot coming out the front of the throat. Well, that's in a missing autopsy report. That's in the one signed on Sunday. He was also talking about a bullet that went in high in the back and transited the neck and came out, he said, and went through the shirt collar. Actually, that bullet hole was above the shirt collar. But anyway, he's aware of both versions. And he's also aware of a contradicting FBI report, because that's the one Hale Boggs is quoting, and that's where Rankin says, well, that's what they first said. So this is a real mess, and it indicates incompetence at the highest levels of this cover-up. So I'm going to conclude with a few slides that put this in the proper perspective. President Kennedy gave a speech in 1962 in support of the Voice of America. He said, quote, "We seek a free flow of information. We are not afraid to entrust the American people with unpleasant facts. For a nation that is afraid to let its people judge the truth and falsehood in an open market is a nation that is afraid of its people," end quote. Well, you can apply this to a lot of situations, and you can especially apply this to the JFK medical evidence. There has been no free flow of information. The story kept changing, and nobody in the government wants to admit this or talk about it. Now, there's a famous quote attributed to Galileo. It may be apocryphal. It may be that he never actually said it, but it's worked its way into some of his biographies. And the quote is, "In questions of science, the authority of 1,000 is not worth the humble reasoning of a single individual." Now, Galileo had a sense of drama and a large ego, so he's talking about himself here. He was engaged in this battle with the church, where he was placed on house arrest for the rest of his life, because he claimed that the earth was not the center of the universe, which the church thought it was. He claimed the sun was the center of the universe, and that the earth revolved around the sun. He was supporting Copernicus. The Catholic Church was opposing Copernicus, wanting to believe that the earth was the center of the universe and that the sun revolved around the earth. So this was him defending his own genius and his own courage. But it can be applied to a lot of situations, and I think this can be applied to anyone who studies the JFK medical evidence and comes to independent conclusions through the use of critical thinking, instead of deferring to the pronouncements of authority, which is dangerous. Benjamin Franklin once said, "It is the duty of every citizen to challenge authority." That's a fantastic quote. It particularly applies to the Kennedy assassination. Now, these are the lessons of the JFK medical evidence in this regard. Don't succumb automatically and uncritically to arguments based on authority when it comes to important topics, such as how wars begin and how assassinations are explained. Study the evidence yourself and engage in critical thinking. When you experience cognitive dissonance, it means something. And finally, the federal government and the national media in America have abjectly failed us in regard to the JFK assassination. Don't let it happen again. Don't allow authority figures to do your thinking for you. Do not blindly accept the conclusions of others if they are not supported by the weight of the evidence. So the lesson here is, don't always disbelieve the government, but if the government tells you something about an important event, you should want to see the evidence first before you decide whether you believe the explanation that authority has provided to you. If the evidence you see matches the explanation provided by authority, then fine. Go ahead and believe what they told you. But if the explanation doesn't agree with what you were told by authority, and the story keeps changing, you know there's a problem, and you need to focus in on that subject. So I thank you very much for your attention. I hope you found this presentation useful. Once again, thanks a lot to Jacob for allowing me to make this additional presentation. Thanks.